My name is Michael Hull. I'm the principal of the Scottish Episcopal Institute in Edinburgh. For the last few years, the Scottish Episcopal Institute has run a number of series to aid all of us in our theological reflection and in our learning. Today, I'd like to introduce to you a series by Dr. Euan Grant. Dr. Grant is going to speak to us about the intimacy of God in St. Thomas Aquinas. Dr. Grant lectures at the University of St. Andrews. He is a member of All Saints Church St. Andrews, and he sits on the Faith and Order Board of our church. I welcome him now to be with us, and I look forward to learning as much as I possibly can along with you about, as we call him, the common doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. Euan?
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin today just introducing Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to say over the next few talks possibly some slightly controversial things, some slightly counterintuitive theological positions that Thomas might have held for us in our time, and I'm going to try and explain how those offer us an insight into the intimacy of God, the closeness of God to us, in a way that might not necessarily be obvious at first glance, but which is, in the end, incredibly developed and incredibly rich and incredibly intellectually and even emotionally stimulating. But first, I think it's a good idea to have some sense of who this Thomas Aquinas guy is, some sense of whom it is that we're talking about. So this is really an introduction to Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about his life, which is more interesting than the average university professor's life nowadays. I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe some of the myths and misapprehensions, misconceptions of Thomas, for those of you who might have come across him before, some of the key themes of his theology, and if you're really inspired, which perhaps a few talks down the line, you might be some places that you could look if you wanted to understand Thomas better, if you wanted to read him, if you wanted to read people writing about him, if you wanted to hear more about his thinking. So let's begin with the life of St. Thomas. St. Thomas is a medieval theologian. So he comes after the great period of the Church Fathers, when the patterns and structures of the faith of Christian teaching have largely been formed. And he arrives in what we tend to call the High Middle Ages. In fact, he lives in about almost precisely the middle 50 years of the 13th century, from maybe 1224, maybe 1225 to 1274, and he lives across the scope of Western Europe. He's an Italian by birth, but he works in Paris, he works in Rome, he works in Naples, he works in Orvieto, and he works in Cologne as well. So all across the new Republic of Letters, if you like, in Western Europe, in Latin Christendom, as we might say then. He's born as a nobleman, a sort of aristocrat, in the kingdom of Sicily, so in southern Italy. His father, and at a place called Roccasecca, his father was called Landulf of Aquino, and he was a miles, a knight, a sort of military retainer of the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Frederick II. And his mother was Theodora. It seems that his mother was the more significant and potent character in the family. But the interesting thing about St. Thomas is that despite having this aristocratic background, which aimed him towards a particular career in the church, and I'll say a bit about this, he takes up a very new and almost disreputable form of life. He becomes not the Benedictine. His parents intend for him to become the abbot of Monte Cassino, which you might know is the Benedictine monastery. It's St. Benedict's own monastery. And he's sent off there at about the age of 5 as an oblate. It's where he gets his first education. But he's destined to be the abbot someday. Both of his brothers, or some of his brothers, I think, perhaps I'm wrong about that, and his cousins, became notable Benedictine abbots. So that's a position of real ecclesiastical and therefore also political importance in southern Italy at that time. So he's meant to be the abbot of Monte Cassino. That's what his parents, presumably most of all his mother, have destined him for. That's a sort of standard aristocratic career, you know. The first one inherits, the second one goes into the army, the third one goes into the church. Well, there wouldn't be a much more plum position in the church than the abbot of Monte Cassino. But something new has happened in the broader European church since the beginning of about the 1200s. In previous centuries, the monks, the Benedictines, those who live in single, stable communities in monasteries, generally in the countryside, have been the key people. But from about the 1200s, with two major figures, with St. Francis and with St. Dominic, we see a new religious movement of friars who are not actually the same thing as monks. They tend to live in cities, they move around, and they don't hold property. It's not actually very reputable to be a friar. It's quite unfashionable, it's quite déclassé. But Thomas recognizes that he has a vocation, he has a desire to become one of these Dominican friars. And I'll talk in one of the later talks a little about how his family try to dissuade him from this aspiration. So he doesn't become the abbot of Monte Cassino, he doesn't become a Benedictine monk, he joins the Dominicans, he spends his life teaching in the other great new institution in Europe in the 13th century, the universities. He writes things of all sorts. He writes biblical commentaries, familiar things like that, sermons, hymns, and he writes in medieval academic genres that are not really with us today, like quodlibetal questions and summae. And he writes an enormous volume of work. Probably the most famous single volume or single work being the Summa Theologiae, the summary, if you like, of theology, of all theology. And we're going to talk through some of the central themes of that book over the three following talks. He through his life, combines the academic vocation with a vocation of prayer, even we might say a sort of mystical vocation. He has this intense and interestingly medieval piety, while there's a great sense that the spiritual is the high thing to which to aspire. There was a point in Thomas's life where he was afflicted by toothache, and after prayer he was relieved of toothache. The tooth came out. And as a reminder of God's grace in that, he carried around in a leather pouch the tooth from whose pain he had been relieved for the rest of his life. So there's a real mixture of the earthy and the spiritual in Thomas's life and in Thomas's piety. And perhaps that comes to the most interesting crisis towards the end of Thomas's life, where with many of his most significant theological works left unfinished, including the Summa Theologiae, he has some sort of mystical experience, and he decides that it's time for him to stop writing. He says, "All that I have written appears to me as so much straw after the things which have been revealed to me." And this famously comes right at the end of Thomas's life. He gives up his writing, and not long afterwards he dies in a place called Fossa Nova in northern Italy. And not long after that, in 1323, he was canonized by John the 22nd, and for his order of friars, the Dominicans, he became the legally required theological authority. But his fame and his influence really only continued to grow for hundreds of years afterwards. And he becomes, as the principal of the NCI was saying, the common doctor, probably the single most significant medieval thinker for all branches of for all branches of Western Christianity, a major source, a sort of official mascot, if you like, of Catholic theology, but also a major source for many of the more scholastically inclined Protestant thinkers in the 1500s, 1600s, and up to our own day. So that's St. Thomas. Quite an interesting flesh and blood man, actually, but engaged principally in his life in academic endeavours. And if you've come across St. Thomas before, it's likely, I suspect, that you might have come across his thinking in the area probably of something like philosophy of religion. So St. Thomas famously has these arguments for the existence of God, the cosmological argument. We'll give that one give the treatment of that as a sort of be-all and end-all proof, rather short shrift in the next talk. And also the other great sort of legend of St. Thomas is that basically he just takes Aristotle, who it's true was very fashionable in the 1300s, and turns him into a sort of ersatz Christian. I don't think either of those things are the ideal things to focus on with Thomas. He's not really out to prove the existence of God. He's not out to do a sort of secular philosophical theology. What he is doing is exploring God from the reality of the world around him. So the key theme probably is the primacy of God, God coming first, the ultimacy of God, God being at the limit, beyond the limit of everything that we encounter, every all being that we encounter, and also the simplicity of God, the fact that God can only underlie, give reason, give structure to everything if, in some sense, all of the multiplicity, all of the differentiation, all of the, not so much, even the variety of the world, if all of that finally is not reduced to, so it's not sort of pared down to something like a single mathematical equation in the way that a sort of reductionist science might want. So it's not reduced to divine simplicity, but everything else is summed up and held together in the unity of God. And the proofs for the existence of God are only the very first tiny step towards Thomas's exceptionally broad and powerful doctrine of God. And that is one of the things we're going to explore. So we're going to explore God and God as the creator. We'll explore the way to God, God's call to us to become like him in charity. And we'll explore the way in which God gets close to us, if you like, in Jesus Christ. Although the interesting thing about Thomas, and what I want to point out, is that it's not that God has to move to come close to us. Instead, the intimacy of God in Thomas is that God is already as close to us as it is possible to get. God is always infinitely close to us. And so it's us who need to move to change, to be moved and changed by God in order to be brought back to him. So those are the themes that we're going to look at over the next few talks. If you find yourself interested in Aquinas, which I hope you might, at the end of this, there are various people whom you might want to read. I can recommend Brian Davies, who's an excellent interpreter and gives an excellent introduction to Thomas Aquinas. If you want to read Aquinas himself, I would recommend starting with a book called The Compendium Theologiae, which you'll sometimes see published as Aquinas's shorter summa, or Compendium of Theology. And you might find perhaps that Aquinas' own style of writing is a little rebarbative. After all, it's medieval Latin in a very distinctive academic culture that most of us, I mean, some of us do in fact live in that quite a lot of our lives, but most of us don't live submerged in medieval Aristotelian Latinisms most of our time. So if you are interested in Aquinas but not interested in reading him himself, as well as Brian Davies, there are other interesting people in our own time, like Herbert McCabe, Thomas Joseph White, and in the middle 20th century, people like Eric Maskell and Joseph Pieper, and perhaps we can put some links to their work up as an accompaniment to these talks. And likewise, I suppose we could link to some good online resources, because the Dominicans are still carrying on their great forefathers' legacy. And so there are also available quite good YouTube videos by the Thomistic Institute, and even live stream and SoundCloud clips from people who are interested in Thomas in all sorts of ways. So I hope that whets your appetite for hearing more about this man and his thinking on God. He is undoubtedly one of the most significant Christian theologians of the last 1,000 years. And what I hope that I can reveal to you in some way is that his thought has not just a profound intellectual coherence, not just beauty, not just a marriage of faith and reason. These are all sorts of things that, are the sort of standard things about Thomas. Of course, Thomas Aquinas, faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas, arguments for the existence of God. Yes, all of those things are true, but also there is in Aquinas a real sense of the nearness, the intimacy of God, and I hope that we can unfold that as we go through these talks together. Thank you.
Euan, thanks very much for that talk on the life of St. Thomas Aquinas. At the end, you mentioned a number of books we could read, and it brought me back, I don't want to say how many years, to my own studies in philosophy and of Thomas Aquinas, and to a book by a Dominican friar named Thomas Weishaupt, The Life of St. Thomas d'Aquino. And one of the things that stands out in my memory is the way in which Weishaupt talks about Thomas's vocation to the priesthood and to the religious life. And you touched on that a bit, but maybe you could talk a bit more about his tenacity in following what he believed, which I would take to be part of his own intimacy with God, following the call of God as he perceived it.
Well, there are some good stories about that. And I'm going to tell one of them in a later talk, so I shall keep that in reserve slightly. I think there is an important sense in which for Thomas, maybe we want to understand why be a Dominican? What was distinctive about being a Dominican? It wasn't just that he was sort of a rebel, off to join whatever was the thing that would most épater les bourgeois or whatever, most irritate his parents. It was the mission of the Dominicans was preaching. So the Benedictines, on the whole, had a mission of prayer and liturgical service, I suppose you could say, in single places. And we could say that was, in some sense, relatively turned inwards, at least religiously. Economically, it was extremely important. But in terms of the vocation was quite inward. The Dominicans, on the other hand, are the friars preacher, as you'll know. They're the order of preachers, and they have an outward-facing vocation to teach. Their motto is contemplare et aliis tradere contemplata, to contemplate, to look at the things of God, to gaze on the things of God, and then to hand those over, to pass them over to others. And I think that Thomas's tenacity was partly a devotion to truth. I think that comes across very clearly in his writing. That sort of flavors the legends about him in various ways. I'll give some other ones as well. Quite charming stories, some of them. And I think also the sense that there is a new air of mission, really, for the broader Latin Church. I think that's an important part of what he feels drawn to as well. So he does, he has to take on his family, take on his mother. There's one, he doesn't have any autobiographical writings really, but there is one place in his writings where you might expect to see the father as the sort of classic medieval image of parental authority. It might be in when you're allowed to make vows or something like that, a question on this in one of his works. Instead of the father, we do see the mother. So Theodora was clearly, quite a significant woman, and arranged things well. But the sense of vocation, I think, is linked to that sense that truth comes first, and that there is a mission of truth, particularly a mission of preaching at large, and that, I think, must have appealed to Thomas in quite a profound way, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that when we speak about Thomas Aquinas, we can speak about him on two levels, obviously. The level of philosophy or reason, and the level of theology and doctrine and faith. And many times, at least in my career over these years, run into all sorts of people who know St. Thomas Aquinas as the great theologian, as the great exemplar of the Dominican life, as someone to whom we turn to for an answer on almost every theological question. And also other folk who've come to know Thomas through philosophy. So they're not quite so interested in the OP, Order of Preachers after his name, or the ST, the saint did before, but they've read him, and particularly his understanding of Aristotle, Averroes, Avicenna, and so on, all these sorts of philosophical thinkers who are not at all Christian or not tied to theology. So, as you say, it's interesting to think about him in terms of two vocations, pursuing the truth in terms of natural theology, or what we call philosophy on some levels, depending on what school of thought we come from. You might touch on that later. But also in terms of the unpacking of divine revelation, particularly a sense of commentary on Scripture. So I think his vocation is a complex one, both personally and intellectually.
Definitely, and I think that speaks to something interesting about his time as well. I don't believe it's possible that Thomas did encounter... So Aristotle, you'll know that Aristotle is the wave of Aristotle translations. It's the great new thing in the 1200s, 13th century. And I think it's possible that he'd encountered Aristotle before becoming a Dominican. But that was the big reason for going to the new universities, though it was actually incredibly controversial. So, yes, I think there's a really complex aspect of his vocation, which is about how to bring together different intellectual traditions. And as you point out, Aristotle's clearly a pagan writer. Thomas receives not just Aristotle, also a sort of Arabized Aristotle, in fact. So Avicenna, Averroes are major Muslim thinkers who have commented on Aristotle, and there's a hundreds of years long raging debate in the Islamic world about how best to bring in Aristotle with a revealed doctrine. And then Thomas has to synthesize that debate and these new Aristotelian translations, and also the legacy of Augustine, who is really the authority in theological terms, and Pseudo-Dionysius. We don't really... people might be very interested in looking up and finding more about is Pseudo-Dionysius. Perhaps a next year's talks or something. That would be rather more mystical and less theological, I expect. It would be a different flavour. But there are all these strands, and I think one of the things about Thomas which people have been inspired by all the way through the modern era is the way in which, for him, the mission is bringing things together that you don't necessarily see how they fit in advance. I think there is something inspiring about that for us now. I do think that Thomas provides a model for that sort of work by Christian thinking today.
Actually, no, absolutely. I mean, particularly if you think about that image that you described at the end of his life when he says that all that I have written is straw. But it's a moment of theological contemplation. And I mean, there are two ways to take the straw. I mean, in the sense of taking it as if they were, all the things he had written were worthless. Yeah. But another way of looking at it would be in the sense of grace building upon nature and understanding that the things that he had written, things about philosophy and so on, the insights that he had that came to him, even with an intellect that had been aided by the divine. We're still on a human level, but in contemplation, if you will, perhaps an introduction to the beatific vision. I don't intend to describe
it's coming.
what kind of contemplation he was engaged in at the moment, but the idea then that looking upon God, looking directly at God, so not talking about something or not looking at it indirectly as we tend to do in this world, but looking straight on God, he recognized to be the absolute supreme thing.
Yeah.
And so all philosophy, and all the things we might know by natural reason are obviously important because they're given to us by God.
Yeah.
But that's not the same thing as being with God. And I think that's maybe where your talks on intimacy are leading us, in the ways in which Thomas can help us to understand what it may be like to be with God and not just with the things of God. Maybe
I agree, and I think that's a different and also useful reminder for people who are, in my line of work, who are professional theologians, that there is a difference between thinking about God and gazing on God. And we will talk about that in a couple of talks' time as well.
Fantastic. And the second talk is going to be
on God and creation. So we'll get into, and there will be a bit of Aristotle in there, I'm afraid. But
fantastic. So it brings us back to straw in a way.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, we look forward to that. Thank you very much.